All right, so the topic of this video just sort of focuses on the difference between federal and state courts. So the idea is that just like in federalism, there's a state legislature and a federal legislature. You see the same thing with the court system too. So there are state courts and there are federal courts. So it's kind of like a dual court system. So like you can see the flow chart again. Like showed you this in the previous video. That no matter if it's a state issue or a federal issue, the Supreme Court of the United States can be accessed from either side. But let's just take a look at some of the basic types of things that would be like in the state courts and the federal courts. So let's go state courts first. So really most of the action happens on the state side. In fact, like 90% of all of the cases like happen in the state courts. And again, they would happen in the trial courts across the United States. These are like the typical courts that you would have. You could appeal to sort of appeal courts within the state, and then there actually is a state Supreme Court for each state. So most of the action's happening on the right hand side. The types of cases that you're used to hearing about on the news: robbery, assaults, murder, traffic violations, juvenile court, family court. That's all happening in the state courts, like not the federal courts. Um, and then any kind of like civil case. So a civil case is when you're fighting over like a monetary dispute. If you have a civil case and it's not criminal, and you're fighting over a matter that involves a dispute over less than $75,000, typically that's going to be heard on the state side. So again, most of the action is happening within the state courts. On the federal side, you're dealing with issues in which like the United States government is a party to the lawsuit. So what does that mean? That means either that the US government is suing somebody or that the US government itself is being sued. So like typically they're the cases you're seeing on like the federal side. Um, any kind of like constitutional disputes you're typically seeing in federal courts, right? That's not really like a state issue; it'd be more of like a federal court issue. Any kind of crime involving multiple states is generally going to be heard in a federal court. So if there is like a multi-state sort of like drug operation, that's going to be in the federal courts. If you have a criminal that's sort of on a crime spree and the individual crimes are being conducted in multiple states, then generally you're going to be looking at some sort of like federal issue. Any kind of dispute between a state, so that the states themselves can sue each other. If there is a dispute between two states, clearly that case is going to be heard in the federal courts, not one of the individual like state courts. And then any kind of like violation of federal law, there are state laws. Violating those gets you in the state court, or like a federal law being violated gets you on the federal side of this. So, for example, like if you rob a bank, that's a federal crime. That's because the money inside your individual bank is insured by the government. So essentially, when you steal from a bank, you're stealing from the federal government. So that's a federal like sort of violation. So those types of cases be heard on the federal side. And then any sort of like copyright or patent issue, if like copyrights are on works of art, patent would be like sort of an invention. If there's some sort of dispute over copyright, over some sort of like patent that was filed, then that's going to be on the federal side. And then any kind of like civil case, again, you're fighting over money. If the amount is pretty significant, like greater than $75,000, most likely that case will be heard in the federal court system. So again, this is just another example of federalism. There are state courts, there are federal courts. Again, most of the judicial action takes place on the state side, but there are obviously lots of significant issues dealt with in the federal courts too. And again, on each side, you can appeal, and eventually, whether you're in a federal court or a state court, your case could be appealed all the way up to the United States Supreme Court.